welcome to the weekly market roundup on the Rural Radio Network. I am your host, Steve White, joined this week by Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners. Jeff, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, always enjoy it. It's always a lot of fun, Steve.
Well, Jeff, as mentioned, we haven't had any government reports. Things have been shut down. And this week, ending with a couple of reports, we've got the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates, WASDE, as well as crop production. Let's just start with some big takeaways. Anything that kind of jumped out at you as you look at a big report day after kind of a lack of data here?
Yeah, so as you dig in, I think the biggest thing, that stood out was just the corn yield. So you look at that 186 yield on the corn side. Trade was looking for a 183.5. We know that in September, that report, when it came out, was a 186.7. And, last year it ended up at a 179.3 after we had a big pullback in the January numbers. And so I think that was a surprise there. And then as you look at how that all flowed through and you come up with your ending stock numbers, that's where we always like to go look at that on the U.S. side. And you come in at 2.154 billion bushels. Up about 24 million from what the trade was looking at, and then up from the 2.110, up about 44 million from the September report. But I think it's important to kind of put it in perspective is that, when we compare back to where we would have been at the end of the crop year for the 24 and August 31st of 2025, the corn number is 1.325 billion. So we definitely have more stocks around. But then you come over to the bean side and you take 290 million bushels on the ending stock number there. Came in almost exactly where the numbers for the trade was expecting at the 292 level. That's down from 300 in our last report in September, and actually about 30 million bushels or 40 million bushels actually tighter than it would have been where we ended up the 2024 crop year. So that's some of kind of your highlights there, Steve.
Yeah, and Jeff, did they leave themselves any wiggle room, or did they put any sort of language in there saying, just keep in mind, we don't have all the normal data that we would have had? Do you get the sense that they still did everything that they would have, or is there anything in there that would kind of give us an indication that they may have been kind of putting some of this together last minute? Anything that way?
Well, that's a great question. So I think the best way to answer that is we first go and look at the crop production report itself. And that crop production report was put out by NASS, National Ag Statistics Service. And as you dig into the numbers, as we look at when they did their gathering of objective yield data, getting start the latter part of October, carried into the first few days of November. Same thing on the farmer survey side. Looks like they probably surveyed a little bit over 6,000 farmers is what they said they interviewed. So all of that looks really pretty normal, which is really a big surprise to me, which means behind the scenes, there must have been a lot of work being done, even though they physically, by the enumerators, when they physically maybe weren't officially being paid. Then as we look and say, okay, what's been put through the plot from the plots, from the objective yield side, what's been processed through the labs, as we dug in and look at those numbers, the only thing that we can notice is that for both corn and soybeans, there was about 5% less of those, plots that have been put through basically the labs at this time on the corn side. And normally you'd probably see 94, 95%. Probably on the bean side, probably 93, 94%. And each of them this year ended up, about 4% less. So it really looks like pretty much everything, at least on the objective yield side, was the same as what our normal process would be. Then we come in and look at the WASDE itself. We really don't see anything in there that would have indicated or flagged that they didn't take their normal process, which is really pretty amazing for me.
Yeah. No, I was just kind of curious. You just have to kind of wonder what was going on behind the scenes, and maybe that story will be told someday. Getting back to the crop production side of things, on a state level, is there anything we can glean there from yield numbers in terms of both corn and soybeans that might be impacting us here in the state?
Yeah, there really is, I think. And as we dig in, a couple things that kind of stood out to us. We think that 186 number on the yield side is too high. And I mean, that agrees with what the trade's thinking. We really do believe, based on what we've had with conversations with our customers, across the Western Corn Belt, what we've also heard coming out of the Eastern Corn Belt, we think that yield still probably has room to come down 5 or 6 bushels. But then you look at the state level data, and there's a few things that does stand out there. You take Illinois, for instance. Illinois in the November forecast they actually raised that estimate up a couple bushels to 221 bushels the acre compared to 219 bushels the acre in the September report. Our information would really suggest, that maybe should be somewhere closer to maybe a 210 type number. And so there's a lot of room to come back on that. And then you come into Indiana, and they raised the yield in Indiana also a bushel. And overall, what we had heard on the Eastern Corn Belt is that they had, dry conditions, got less than what they'd like for an ideal fill. Illinois was kind of that transition state where you had some dry conditions, but then you also had some southern rust showing up. But then once you cross the river to the west and got into the Western Corn Belt, that's where there's some additional surprises that I think will have to be adjusted going forward. So for instance, for Iowa, they did lower the Iowa corn yield 3 bushels the acre. They brought it from a 219 in September down to a 216. Now, what our data would show is that there's a line somewhere between Highway 20 and Highway 18 in Iowa, northern part of Iowa, yields above that, probably 15, 20 bushels an acre better than last year. But as you work your way south in Iowa, the yields continue to back off. And even stuff that was sprayed is probably off 5 to 10 bushels an acre from last year. And the stuff that didn't necessarily get sprayed, that could be 15, 20 bushels the acre off. So we think there's still room in Iowa to bring that yield down. As we come into Nebraska, Nebraska was another surprise too. 191 bushels the acre. That would have been unchanged for the September forecast. Now, as you look at Nebraska itself, there's a lot of differences within Nebraska. The further north in the state you go, I'd say overall the better yields are. You get up again in that Highway 20 area, coming west out of Sioux City. You've got some yields up in that area. They're probably 15, 20 bushels an acre more than they would have been last year. Highway 81 is kind of the dividing line. East of 81 is a little bit worse than it would have been last year. West of 81, probably a little bit better. But as you work your way south from Sioux City south, I'd say overall the southern rust pressure, there really wasn't much concern on the moisture side, but the southern rust side definitely showed its head. And in those areas, you can see 15, 20 bushel acre below what it would have been last year. Then as you work your way west along, Interstate 80, maybe you don't quite have the southern rust pressure there, but then you get into south central Nebraska, you've got some storm damage, you have a little bit of blue tar spot showing up as you work your way west, and then you get out there in that Holdridge area, and I think the yields are off a little bit out in that area also. So we think there's room to bring the yields down on the corn. As we dug in and took a look at the soybeans, we really don't have too much to disagree with on the soybean side, and I'd say that's the same at the state level. Nebraska, as a matter of fact, they raised the yield 3 bushels the acre from 61 bushel the acre in September to 64 here in November. So they brought that up 3 bushels. I think there's maybe even room in Nebraska to bring that up. But if they bring that up, though, I think in future reports, I do think that they will physically have to bring down some of the Eastern Corn Belt data. But one of the things that we find interesting, so keep in mind what will happen with this basically yield data now. As we go forward, there will not be an adjustment in December. Those yields will stay as they are. But what we see for the January, what NASA's told us is that they rely heavier on the farmer surveys than they do the objective yield data for January. So keep in mind, farmers, as you're being surveyed, they definitely value that data. So it's going to be interesting. We think as we come out in the January numbers, we think we'll end up seeing corn yield come down some more. Bean yields, could hang around kind of right where we're at.
Very interesting. As a reminder, this is the weekly market roundup on the Rural Radio Network. I'm Steve White. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is joining us this week, breaking down both WASDE and crop production reports that have come out late in the week here. Jeff, let's talk for a moment about flash sales. Anything that happened in that way that we can get any information out of?
I was really thankful to see those flash sales numbers come out. And keep in mind what drives those flash sales numbers. That's the daily numbers. You'll see those come out in the morning, generally around 7:30. Each of the individual commodities has a different trigger level. But basically what happens is that if on corn and beans you see a sale the previous day of over 100,000 metric tons. So what would that be? Say like a couple cargoes, couple shiploads of grain to a destination, to a country. Or if it's just sold and it's not named, it goes into the unknown category. Those are reported. And what they did at 11 o'clock, they dumped all those. USDA gave those all out. I think part of the information that came out in that's what put a little bit of pressure on the bean market. Even though we tightened up the ending stocks a little bit, I think the trade was looking to see within the flash sales, how many times did China show up? How many soybeans did they take? Overall, China did show up. They showed up on some sales. And what we ended up seeing, they probably took a little bit over 300,000 metric tons. So keep in mind, that's going to be a little bit over 6 cargoes. Now, along with that, there was some unknown categories, right? We're at that probably for another 500,000 metric tons. Can't say for sure whether or not that was China or not. But the point to all that was there wasn't enough trade sales that were suspected to be China to make a big difference. And I think that's why we've seen a little bit of sell-off on the beans as we're seeing the trade go right now.
Jeff, we're starting to run out of time. Before we get to the end here, any other quick takeaways you had from the reports here?
Yeah, I think one thing we have to talk a little bit about is we got to dig into the corn balance sheet just a little bit.
That's a good
idea.
We
know that there was an adjustment, 207 million bushels beginning stock increase, which would have came from the September quarterly stock numbers. As a result of lowering the yield 0.7 of a bushel, that meant our total supply was only up 144,000. But they did raise. They didn't do anything at all with the feed demand number, feed and residual number. We think there will need to be some adjustments with that going forward. But and that would probably be adjustments lower. But they did raise exports 100 million bushels, and that's why we only ended up seeing a 44 million bushel increase in ending stocks. The only thing over on soybeans, and then I'll wrap it up, is that they did reduce the export number on soybeans 50 million, which based on where our pace is at, and based on what China's doing, probably is a realistic thing for them to do at this time.
Yeah. And Jeff, just as we come to the end here, now that we know all this and we have some yield numbers, we've seen some reports that are giving us a more solid look than what we've had for a while. How do you think all this kind of will maybe influence going into next year? How might a guy think about some planting decisions in light of what kind of we're seeing here?
Yeah, exactly. So I think what we're going to end up seeing here is that I think the full story on that isn't quite yet told. We do need to see whether or not we can get China to come in. As I've done some calculations as it relates to soybeans, without China really too much in the mix, I can get to about a 1.5 billion bushel export number, but we're going to need China in the mix to get all the way up to that 1.635 or a little bit higher. I think based off of that, we are getting prices high enough in here, as you look at it on the new crop soybean side, that I think that could encourage a little bit of soybean acres planting, some shift as we come from the corn over to the beans. But I think if you do make any type of rotational shifts there, I really think you got to look at making some new crop sales.
Well, very good. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners. Thanks for being with us.
You bet. Always enjoy it. Thanks a lot, Steve.
Yeah, and you can probably catch Jeff at the Gateway Farm Expo in Kearney this coming week. As a reminder, commodities futures do involve substantial risk of loss, not suitable to all investors. That is the weekly market roundup. I'm Steve White on the Rural Radio Network.